The former Minister of Defense of the United States, Dean Acheson, tore down the defense perimeter, so-called Acheson Line, in the National Press Club on January 12, 1915. The Aleutian Islands, Japan, Okinawa, and the Philippines formed the Acheson Line, which served as a line of defense to prevent the spread of socialism throughout Asia. He stated that the US couldn't take charge in the region which fell outside of the line, and if they were attacked, they needed to be protected by the UN. He has come under fire for the way the Acheson Line was utilized to justify the Korean War because Taiwan and Korea were left out. The prevailing view in Korean academia is that the Acheson Line namely was the cause of the Korean War. So from now on, we can learn about the Acheson Line and the Korean War. Since World War II, the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union has escalated and the Cold War has intensified. The US Red New World was what the Truman administration aimed to establish. The ultimate goal of the US is to reduce the Soviet Union's influence over the world. The US was afraid of the Soviet Union's expansion. Therefore, the US tried to obstruct the spreading of the Soviet Union's influence. They implemented containment policies such as the Berlin blockade, the Truman Doctrine, NATO. The US attempted to exert authority over Korea, but given the price the US paid for maintaining the balance of power with Europe, Korea is now out of reach. In this situation, the US drew the Acheson Line to prevent an impending socialism crisis over East Asia. He claimed that Japan, Okinawa, and the Philippines are important regions that are mostly connected to the security of the Pacific Ocean. It is needed to be protected by the US military defense. The Philippines and the US have cordial relations. The US occupies Japan and has military bases there. The US also has the Aleutian Islands as part of its domain. Namely, the US didn't need to take responsibility for Korea's security because they were excluded by the Rhine. Given this situation, North Korea judged that the US would not care for South Korea. Finally, North Korea invaded South Korea and triggered the Korean War on June 25, 1915. The 38th Parallel North served as the focal point of escalating hostility and violence between North Korea and South Korea in 1949 and 1950. Both desired a rapid war and a unified Korea through force. In particular, Lee Seung-ma strongly expressed his will to unify by force. However, the US kept deterring Lee Seung-ma's hard line. At the time, South Korea was dependent on the US Army. As a result, the South was unable to start a war without US approval. However, the US desperately tried to prevent South Korea from launching a war by preemptively attacking North Korea. They only permitted the war if North Korea first provoked the South, allowing the South to launch a counterattack. Therefore, what South Korea could do was lure North Korea's unprovoked attacks and win the support of the United States when a war breaks out. Tom Connolly, a former US senator, stated North Korea is not the primary target of the US military policy in this case. The Soviet Union and China could also occupy Korea if they so desired. His opinion does not align with that of the United States Department of State, the department said in response. However, the Acheson Line and the opinion of Connolly made waves in South Korea. Lee Seung-ma later fused because it appeared that those actions were a communist invitation to take over South Korea. However, South Korea wasn't included in the defense line of the US before the Korean War broke out. However, it is not true that the US didn't care about Korea at all. Acheson argued that while the United States is relatively less responsible than other regions, South Korea is also responsible and should act accordingly. Actually, the containment policy of the US was usually focused on Europe. Korea was also less significant than Japan and the other Pacific nations. In the US shoes, it stands to reason that the US drew a defense line based on the Pacific coast, where US military bases are located in a way. Also, the Acheson Line switched the order of the strategic line coined by Douglas MacArthur. However, the situation that Korea was excluded from the Acheson Line implies that the US would weigh in if the Korean War broke out and South Korea should go on the warpath with their own national defense. Due to this uncertainty and the fact that the Korean War and the Acheson Line occurred at the same time, many Koreans have come to feel that the Acheson Line adequately explains the conflict. However, the decision was made because it was impractical to allocate resources to South Korea due to a lack of American capability at the time, despite the fact the US did not view South Korea as a major strategic station. The Acheson Declaration, which stated that both the US policy at the time and Acheson Korean policy reflected, also stated that the US policy on the Korean Peninsula was not constant. Also, the Acheson Declaration was an inconsistent decision from Acheson's point of view, which insisted on the importance of Korea. Instead, this can be explained by the fact that Acheson took the attitude of the House and Senate at the time into mind. As a result, the Acheson Declaration is not an individual decision made by Acheson, but rather a speech that represents the view of a House and Senate members as well as national politicians in general. So we can't tell if the Acheson Line triggered the Korean War. So thank you for watching the video, and please don't forget to click the subscribe and the like button.